The heavy oak doors of courtroom 3B groaned as Michael Chen pushed them open, the sound echoing through the cavernous space like a gunshot. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he clutched a manila folder containing documents that represented everything he had left in this world. The folder's edges were soft from handling, creased from being opened and closed countless times during sleepless nights when he reviewed every detail, every argument, every reason why his 80-year-old daughter Emma belonged with him. The courtroom stretched before him like a cathedral of judgment, its mahogany panels gleaming under harsh fluorescent lights that seemed to strip away any pretense of warmth. Michael's suit, purchased 3 years ago for his wife's funeral, hung loose on his frame. The fabric had faded from charcoal to a tired gray, and the jacket's sleeves revealed frayed cuffs that he tried to hide by tugging them down repeatedly during the morning. His shoes, once polished leather, now bore the scuff marks of a man who walked everywhere because his car had been repossessed 6 months ago. As he walked down the center aisle, his footsteps seemed unnaturally loud against the marble floor. The sound reminded him of Emma's first steps, how she had toddled across their old apartment's hardwood floors with such determination, her tiny hands reaching for him with complete trust. That same trust lived in her eyes now, even as their world had crumbled around them. Even as he worked 16-hour days between his janitorial job at the law firm and weekend shifts at the grocery store, just to keep food on their table and a roof over their heads. The opposing counsel's table occupied the space closest to the judge's bench, and Michael couldn't help but notice the stark contrast it presented. 3 attorneys in pristine suits sat behind a table covered with neat stacks of documents bound in leather portfolios. Their briefcases bore the embossed logos of prestigious firms, and their movements carried the confidence of people who had never questioned whether they belonged in this room. The lead attorney, a woman with silver hair pulled back in a perfect chignon, glanced up as Michael passed. Her eyes took in his appearance with a quick, dismissive sweep before returning to her papers. These were Emma's maternal grandparents' representatives, the Worthington family attorneys who had made it clear from the beginning that they considered Michael an unfit guardian for their late daughter's child. Victoria Worthington had made no secret of her disapproval when her daughter Sarah had married Michael 7 years ago. A community college professor, she had called him then, though he had actually been teaching constitutional law at the state university. The distinction had never mattered to Victoria, who measured worth in stock portfolios and country club memberships rather than academic achievements or character. Michael settled into his chair at the defendant's table, the metal legs scraping against the floor with a harsh screech that made him wince. He placed his folder on the table's surface, noting how small and inadequate it looked compared to the mountain of legal documents arranged across from him. His entire case, his entire argument for why he deserved to keep his daughter, fit into a single manila folder that cost 99 cents at the dollar store. The courtroom began to fill with the usual cast of characters that populated these proceedings. A court reporter settled behind her machine, her fingers already poised over the keys with practiced efficiency. A bailiff stood near the judge's chamber door, his uniform crisp and his expression neutral. Michael recognized him from previous hearings, a man named Officer Rodriguez who had once given him a sympathetic nod when things had gotten particularly heated during a custody evaluation session. "Where in the world are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are as you hear this story unfold?" Michael's story is about to take a turn that will surprise everyone in that courtroom, including himself. The air conditioning hummed with a steady drone that seemed to emphasize the weight of silence in the room. Michael's hands found their way to his wedding ring, a simple gold band that he still wore despite Sarah's death 18 months ago. The metal had grown thin from his nervous habit of rotating it around his finger, a gesture that had become as automatic as breathing. Sarah had placed that ring on his finger in a small ceremony at the university chapel, surrounded by his colleagues from the law department and a handful of her family members who had made the effort to attend despite Victoria's obvious disapproval. The memories of that day felt like artifacts from another life, when Michael had been Professor Chen, respected in his field and published in several prestigious legal journals. His specialty had been constitutional law, particularly the intersection of family rights and governmental authority. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now found himself on the wrong side of a family court proceeding, his own parental rights under attack by people who had never shown Emma the unconditional love that had defined every day of Michael's life since her birth. A door behind the judge's bench opened with a soft click, and the bailiff straightened to attention. Judge Harrison emerged from his chambers, his black robes flowing behind him like the wings of some predatory bird. He was a man in his early 60s, with silver hair that spoke of decades on the bench and eyes that had seen every sob story, every excuse, every desperate plea that had ever been offered in his courtroom. His face carried the weathered expression of someone who had learned to maintain emotional distance from the human dramas that played out before him daily. "All rise," the bailiff announced, his voice carrying the authority of ritual and tradition. Michael pushed himself to his feet, his knees protesting slightly from the long hours he'd spent on them the night before, scrubbing floors at the downtown law firm where he worked. The building housed 3 floors of attorneys who specialized in corporate law, their offices filled with expensive furniture and walls lined with diplomas from Ivy League schools. Michael had cleaned those offices for 2 years now, emptying their trash cans and polishing their conference tables, invisible to the lawyers who stayed late working on cases that would earn them more in a single billing hour than Michael made in a week. The Honorable Judge Harrison presiding, the bailiff continued, and Michael watched as the judge settled into his high-backed chair with the casual authority of a man who held the power to reshape lives with a single decision. The judge's nameplate gleamed under the courtroom lights, and Michael noticed how the man's eyes immediately went to the opposing counsel's table, taking in their professional appearance with a slight nod of acknowledgement. When Judge Harrison's gaze finally shifted to Michael, the change in his expression was subtle but unmistakable. His eyes narrowed slightly, taking in the ill-fitting suit, the worn shoes, the manila folder that served as Michael's entire legal arsenal. The judge's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly, and Michael recognized the look he'd seen countless times over the past 18 months. It was the expression of someone who had already made assumptions about his character, his fitness as a parent, his worthiness to stand in this courtroom and fight for his child. "Be seated," Judge Harrison said, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a man who had spoken these words thousands of times. The sound of shuffling papers and settling bodies filled the air as everyone took their places for what would prove to be a hearing that none of them would ever forget. Michael's hands found his folder again, his fingers tracing the edge of the manila cover that contained everything he had prepared to say about why Emma belonged with him. Inside were photographs of their small apartment, carefully organized to show that it was clean and safe despite being modest. There were letters from Emma's teachers, praising her academic performance and noting how well-adjusted she seemed despite the tragedy of losing her mother. There were pay stubs from both his jobs, proof that he was working himself to exhaustion to provide for his daughter's needs. But as he looked around the courtroom, at the polished surfaces and expensive suits, at the judge's dismissive expression and the opposing counsel's confident smirks, Michael began to wonder if any of it would matter. In this world of legal precedent and custody evaluations, of financial assessments and home studies, would anyone see what really mattered? Would anyone understand that every sacrifice he had made, every sleepless night and aching back, every moment of exhaustion and worry, had been worth it to see Emma smile when he picked her up from school? The morning light streaming through the courtroom's tall windows cast long shadows across the floor, and Michael realized that this moment, this hearing, would determine not just his future but Emma's as well. Everything he had worked for, everything he had fought to preserve since Sarah's death, would be decided by a man who had already looked at him and found him wanting. Judge Harrison adjusted his reading glasses and pulled the case file toward him with deliberate slowness. The papers rustled as he flipped through them, his expression growing more skeptical with each page. The silence stretched uncomfortably long, broken only by the steady hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. Case number 2024 FC 8847, in the matter of Emma Chen, Judge Harrison announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had been honed over decades on the bench. He looked up from the file, his eyes moving between the 2 tables with practiced assessment. "This is a petition for modification of custody filed by Victoria and Robert Worthington, seeking full custody of their granddaughter Emma Chen, currently age 8. Michael felt his stomach tighten as the judge's words made the situation brutally real. Emma wasn't just his daughter in this room, she was a case number, a legal matter to be decided by strangers who had never seen her laugh at his terrible jokes or watched her carefully arrange her stuffed animals before bed each night. The lead attorney for the Worthingtons rose smoothly from her chair, her movements fluid and confident. "Your Honor, Margaret Blackwood for the petitioners Victoria and Robert Worthington," she said, her voice carrying the cultured tones of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. "We appreciate the court's time today in this matter of utmost importance to our clients and, most critically, to the welfare of young Emma Chen." Judge Harrison nodded approvingly at her polished presentation, then turned his attention to Michael. "And you are representing yourself, Mr. Chen?" The question carried a subtle tone of disapproval, as if self-representation was somehow evidence of poor judgment or inadequate commitment to the case. "Yes, Your Honor," Michael replied, rising to his feet. The chair scraped against the floor again, and he winced internally at the harsh sound. Michael Chen, appearing pro se. His voice came out quieter than he had intended, and he cleared his throat before continuing. "I'm here to respond to the petition and to demonstrate why Emma should remain in my custody." The judge made a note on his pad, and Michael caught sight of the man's expensive fountain pen, a Mont Blanc that probably cost more than Michael made in a month. Judge Harrison's wedding ring caught the light, a thick band of gold that spoke of stability and success, everything that Michael's own thin, worn ring no longer represented in the eyes of the court. "Ms. Blackwood, you may present your opening statement," Judge Harrison said, settling back in his chair with the air of someone preparing to hear a familiar story. The attorney's smile was sharp as a blade as she moved to the podium, her heels clicking against the marble floor with military precision. "Thank you, Your Honor." Ms. Blackwood's voice filled the courtroom with practiced authority. "The petitioners come before this court today not out of malice or spite, but out of genuine concern for their granddaughter's welfare and future prospects. Since the tragic death of their daughter Sarah Chen 18 months ago, they have watched with growing alarm as Emma's living conditions have deteriorated under her father's care." Michael's hands clenched into fists on the table's surface. Every word felt like a physical blow, each accusation a knife twisting deeper into his chest. He thought of Emma's face that morning, how she had hugged him extra tight and whispered that she loved him, as if somehow she knew that this day would determine their future together. The evidence will show that Mr. Chen, despite his undoubtedly good intentions, simply lacks the financial resources and stability to provide Emma with the opportunities she deserves. Ms. Blackwood continued, her voice gaining momentum like a prosecutor building toward a conviction. "While he works multiple low-wage jobs, Emma is left in the care of various babysitters and after-school programs. She has been forced to change schools twice due to housing instability, and her educational opportunities are severely limited by her father's economic circumstances." Judge Harrison was taking notes now, his pen moving across the legal pad with quick, efficient strokes. Michael could see the man's expression hardening with each point the attorney made, each carefully crafted argument designed to paint Michael as a loving but inadequate father whose good intentions couldn't overcome harsh economic realities. "In contrast," Ms. Blackwood said, her voice softening with what sounded like genuine compassion, "the Worthingtons can provide Emma with a stable, loving home in an excellent school district. They have the financial means to ensure she receives the best possible education, including music lessons, tutoring, and extracurricular activities that will prepare her for success in life. Most importantly, they can provide her with the emotional stability and security that every child deserves." The attorney paused, allowing her words to sink in before delivering what Michael knew would be the most damaging part of her argument. "The petitioners are not seeking to remove Emma from her father's life entirely, Your Honor. They propose generous visitation rights that would allow Mr. Chen to maintain a meaningful relationship with his daughter while ensuring that her daily needs are met in an environment that can truly support her growth and development." As Ms. Blackwood returned to her seat, Judge Harrison's eyes fixed on Michael with an expression that made his blood run cold. The judge's gaze took in every detail of his appearance, from the frayed cuffs of his shirt to the scuffed toes of his shoes. It was the look of a man who had already begun to form an opinion, who saw before him exactly what the attorney had described, a well-meaning but ultimately inadequate father whose love for his child couldn't overcome the harsh realities of his circumstances. "Mr. Chen," Judge Harrison said, his voice carrying a note of what might have been pity, "you may respond to the petitioner's opening statement. But I have to ask, are you certain you wouldn't benefit from legal representation in this matter?" The court can provide you with information about legal aid services if cost is a concern. The suggestion hung in the air like an insult, implying that Michael's decision to represent himself was evidence of either stubborn pride or simple ignorance of the legal system's complexities. Michael stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom upon him, knowing that his next words would begin to determine whether he would tuck Emma into bed that night or if she would be sleeping in a room that had been prepared for her in the Worthington mansion across town. Michael stood at his table, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on his shoulders like a physical force. The manila folder seemed to mock him with its simplicity, a stark contrast to the leather-bound portfolios and expensive briefcases that surrounded the opposing counsel's table. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged courtroom. "Your Honor," Michael began, his voice steadier than he felt, "I understand the court's concern about legal representation, but I chose to represent myself because no one knows my daughter better than I do. No attorney, however skilled, can speak to the bond Emma and I share or the sacrifices I've made to ensure her happiness and well-being." Judge Harrison's pen remained poised over his notepad, but Michael noticed the man wasn't actually writing. Instead, the judge's expression carried the patient tolerance of someone listening to a story he'd heard countless times before. The look suggested that heartfelt pleas from desperate parents were as common in his courtroom as morning coffee in his chambers. "I won't pretend that our life has been easy since Sarah died," Michael continued, opening his folder and removing a photograph. The picture showed Emma on her 8th birthday, just 3 months after her mother's funeral. Despite everything they'd been through, her smile was genuine and bright as she blew out the candles on a homemade cake that Michael had stayed up until midnight perfecting. "But difficulty doesn't equal inadequacy, Your Honor. Emma is thriving because she's loved unconditionally, not because she has access to expensive tutoring or lives in a mansion." Ms. Blackwood's lips curved into what might have been a smile, but her eyes remained cold and calculating. She leaned over to whisper something to her associates, and Michael caught the sound of muffled laughter from their table. The sound hit him like a slap, confirming what he'd suspected from the moment he walked into the courtroom. They saw him as a joke, a pathetic figure whose earnest words couldn't disguise his obvious inadequacies. "Mr. Chen," Judge Harrison interrupted, his tone carrying a note of impatience that made Michael's stomach drop, "while I appreciate your devotion to your daughter, this court must consider practical realities. The petitioners have raised legitimate concerns about educational opportunities, financial stability, and Emma's long-term prospects. Can you honestly tell me that you're able to provide for her future needs on a janitor's salary?" The question hung in the air like a blade, sharp and cutting. Michael felt heat rise in his cheeks as he realized the judge had just reduced his entire worth as a parent to his job title and paycheck. The man behind the bench saw only the surface, the worn suit and tired eyes, without any understanding of what lay beneath. "Your Honor," Michael said carefully, trying to keep his voice level despite the anger building in his chest, "respectfully, being a janitor doesn't make me less capable of loving my daughter or providing for her needs. I work 2 jobs to ensure Emma has everything she requires. She's never missed a meal, never lacked for clothing or school supplies, and she's consistently made honor roll despite the challenges we've faced." Judge Harrison made another note on his pad, but his expression suggested he was simply going through the motions rather than seriously considering Michael's words. The judge's wedding ring caught the light again as he wrote, and Michael found himself wondering if this man had ever struggled to pay a bill, ever worked multiple jobs just to keep food on the table, ever felt the crushing weight of responsibility that came with being a single parent. "Mr. Chen," the judge said, setting down his pen and fixing Michael with a stare that felt like being examined under a microscope, "I'm sure you're doing your best within your limitations. But this court must consider what's in Emma's best interests, not what makes you feel better about your circumstances. The Worthingtons can provide opportunities that you simply cannot match." The words hit Michael like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to emphasize his inadequacy in the eyes of the court. He thought of Emma's face that morning when he dropped her off at school, how she'd looked back at him through the classroom window and given him a thumbs up, their secret signal that everything would be okay. She had such faith in him, such unwavering belief that he would always protect her and keep their family together. "Your Honor," Michael tried again, his voice beginning to show the strain of maintaining composure in the face of such casual dismissal. "With respect, I believe you're making assumptions about my capabilities based on incomplete information. Emma's well-being isn't measured solely by the size of our apartment or the brand of her clothes. She's happy, healthy, and secure in the knowledge that she's loved." Judge Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly, and for the first time since the hearing began, he seemed to be paying full attention to Michael's words. However, his expression suggested surprise rather than respect, as if he was taken aback by a janitor who dared to challenge his assessment of the situation. "Mr. Chen," the judge said, his voice taking on a sharper edge, "I've been presiding over family court for over 20 years. I believe I'm qualified to assess what constitutes a child's best interests. Your emotional attachment to your daughter, while admirable, doesn't change the fundamental realities of your situation." The court reporter's fingers flew over her machine, capturing every word of what was becoming less of a hearing and more of a predetermined conclusion. Michael could see the bailiff watching the proceedings with professional detachment, his expression neutral but his posture suggesting he'd witnessed similar scenes countless times before. Ms. Blackwood rose from her chair again, her movement smooth and predatory. "Your Honor, if I may," she said, her voice carrying false sympathy that made Michael's skin crawl, "I think Mr. Chen's passionate defense of his circumstances, while touching, actually reinforces our point. He's so focused on what he perceives as love that he's blind to the limitations he's placing on Emma's future." Michael felt something shift inside him, a slow burn of anger that had been building since he'd first received the custody petition. These people had never seen him help Emma with her homework at the kitchen table, never watched him read her bedtime stories with different voices for each character, never witnessed the quiet moments of joy they shared despite their modest circumstances. They saw only poverty and struggle, mistaking financial limitation for parental inadequacy. The weight of the moment pressed against Michael's chest like a heavy stone. He watched as Ms. Blackwood returned to her seat with the satisfied air of someone who had just delivered a killing blow. The opposing counsel's table radiated confidence, their expensive suits and polished demeanor creating an aura of inevitable victory that seemed to fill the courtroom like smoke. "Your Honor," Ms. Blackwood continued, her voice taking on the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to winning, "we'd like to present evidence regarding Emma's current living conditions and educational environment." She nodded to one of her associates, who immediately began removing photographs from a leather portfolio with the efficiency of a well-rehearsed performance. Michael's heart sank as he recognized the images being arranged on an easel facing the judge. They were pictures of his apartment building, but taken from angles that emphasized every flaw and imperfection. The cracked sidewalk leading to the entrance looked like a hazardous obstacle course. The small playground behind the building, where Emma spent hours happily swinging and climbing, appeared rundown and potentially dangerous. Even their apartment, photographed during what must have been a surprise inspection by a court-appointed social worker, looked cramped and shabby despite Michael's efforts to keep everything clean and organized. "As you can see, Your Honor," Ms. Blackwood said, using a laser pointer to highlight various aspects of the photographs, "Emma is currently residing in a building that shows clear signs of deferred maintenance. The playground equipment appears unsafe, and the neighborhood itself has experienced an increase in crime over the past year according to police statistics." Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly, studying the images with the focused attention he had not given to Michael's words. The judge's expression grew more concerned with each photograph, his eyebrows drawing together in a frown that suggested he was already forming conclusions about Michael's fitness as a parent based solely on these carefully selected images. Furthermore, Ms. Blackwood continued, "Emma has been enrolled in 3 different schools over the past 18 months due to housing instability. Her current school, while adequate, lacks the advanced programs and resources that would be available to her in the district where the Worthingtons reside." She gestured to another set of photographs showing a modest elementary school with aging playground equipment and a parking lot that had seen better days. Michael wanted to object, to explain that each move had been necessary due to circumstances beyond his control, that Emma's teachers consistently praised her academic performance regardless of which school she attended. But Judge Harrison's expression made it clear that interruptions would not be welcome. The man behind the bench was absorbing every detail of the prosecution's case with the attention of someone who had already begun to reach a verdict. The court reporter's fingers continued their steady rhythm across the machine, capturing every word that was slowly but surely building a case against Michael's fitness as a parent. He thought of Emma's excitement that morning when she'd shown him a drawing she'd made of their apartment, complete with hearts decorating the walls and a big sun shining through the windows. In her eyes, their small home was perfect because they were together. In contrast, Ms. Blackwood said, activating a presentation screen that had been wheeled into the courtroom, the Worthington residence offers Emma a stable, nurturing environment with access to excellent educational opportunities. The screen filled with images of a sprawling colonial home surrounded by manicured lawns and mature trees. A swimming pool sparkled in the background, and the interior shots revealed rooms that looked like they belonged in a magazine spread rather than a lived-in home. Emma would have her own bedroom suite, Ms. Blackwood explained, highlighting a room that was larger than Michael's entire living room. The images showed built-in bookshelves, a study area with a computer, and enough space for all the activities and interests that an 80-year-old girl might develop. The Worthingtons have already researched the finest private schools in their area and are prepared to provide Emma with tutoring, music lessons, and any other enrichment opportunities she might desire. Judge Harrison was taking detailed notes now, his pen moving rapidly across the legal pad as he absorbed every detail of what the Worthingtons could provide. Michael watched the man's expression shift from professional detachment to something approaching enthusiasm as the material advantages were laid out like a feast before him. "Mr. Chen," Judge Harrison said suddenly, his voice cutting through the presentation like a blade, "I'd like to understand your employment situation more clearly. You mentioned working multiple jobs. Can you provide specifics about your income and work schedule?" Michael felt his throat tighten as all eyes in the courtroom focused on him. He knew this question was designed to highlight his financial limitations, to underscore the vast gap between what he could provide and what the Worthingtons offered. "Your Honor, I work as a maintenance supervisor for Coleman Associates downtown, primarily evening shifts. I also work weekends at Riverside Grocery to supplement our income." "Maintenance supervisor," Judge Harrison repeated, making a note that seemed to emphasize the humble nature of Michael's employment. "And what does that entail exactly?" The question carried a tone that suggested the judge was unfamiliar with the concept of physical labor, as if such work existed in a different universe from his own experience. "I'm responsible for cleaning and maintaining the offices in a 3-story law firm," Michael replied, trying to keep his voice steady despite the humiliation of having his work life dissected in front of strangers. "The position requires reliability, attention to detail, and the ability to work independently during hours when the building is otherwise empty." Ms. Blackwood exchanged a meaningful look with her associates, and Michael caught the subtle shake of her head that suggested his answer had played directly into their strategy. Everything he said seemed to reinforce their narrative of a man whose circumstances, however sympathetic, made him unsuitable as the primary guardian for a child with limitless potential. "And your work schedule interferes with your ability to be present for Emma's daily needs, Ms." Blackwood interjected smoothly, phrasing it as a statement rather than a question. "You work evenings when she should be receiving help with homework, and weekends when other children are participating in family activities and building social connections." Michael felt the trap closing around him with each carefully crafted observation. Every aspect of his life that he'd structured around Emma's needs was being twisted into evidence of inadequacy. The evening work schedule that allowed him to take her to school each morning became proof of his unavailability. The weekend job that helped pay for her clothes and school supplies became evidence that he couldn't provide proper family time. Judge Harrison set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, his expression carrying the weight of a decision that seemed to have already crystallized in his mind. The silence that followed felt oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the soft whisper of the court reporter's machine. Michael could feel his heart hammering against his ribs as he waited for whatever verdict was about to be delivered in this preliminary hearing. "Mr. Chen," the judge said finally, his voice carrying a tone that Michael recognized from countless interactions with authority figures over the past 18 months, "I want to be clear that this court appreciates your dedication to your daughter. No one is questioning your love for Emma or your desire to provide for her. However, love alone is not sufficient when we're discussing a child's future prospects and opportunities." The words hit Michael like physical blows, each phrase carefully chosen to sound compassionate while delivering a devastating assessment of his worthiness as a parent. He watched Judge Harrison's face, noting how the man's expression had settled into the practiced neutrality of someone delivering an unpleasant but necessary judgment. The evidence presented today paints a picture of a child whose life has been marked by instability and limited opportunities, Judge Harrison continued, gesturing toward the photographs that still dominated the easel beside Ms. Blackwood's table. While I'm certain you're doing your best within your means, the court must consider what environment would best serve Emma's long-term interests. Michael felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized the direction this hearing was taking. The judge had already made his decision, probably before Michael had even spoken his first word. Everything that followed would be merely procedural, a legal formality designed to justify a conclusion that had been reached the moment Judge Harrison had taken in Michael's worn suit and humble demeanor. "Your Honor," Michael said, his voice stronger than he felt, "with respect, I believe you're making assumptions about Emma's well-being based on superficial factors. She's not suffering or deprived. She's a happy, healthy child who feels secure and loved in our home, regardless of its size or our neighborhood's demographics." Judge Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly, and for a moment his mask of professional courtesy slipped to reveal something that might have been irritation. "Mr. Chen," he said, his voice taking on a sharper edge, "I've been presiding over family court for over 2 decades. I believe I'm qualified to assess the difference between adequate care and optimal development opportunities for children." The rebuke hung in the air like a challenge, and Michael felt the familiar burn of anger that had sustained him through every slight, every dismissive comment, every assumption about his capabilities based on his appearance or employment. These people saw only the surface, the external markers of success or failure, without any understanding of the sacrifices and dedication that defined his relationship with Emma. What part of this story resonates most with you? Have you ever felt judged by people who only saw the surface of your life without understanding what lay beneath? Share your thoughts as Michael's story reaches its crucial turning point. Ms. Blackwood rose from her chair again, sensing the judge's growing impatience with Michael's persistence. "Your Honor," she said smoothly, "I think Mr. Chen's emotional attachment to his current situation, while understandable, demonstrates exactly why this matter requires objective judicial review. Sometimes loving parents can't see beyond their own limitations to recognize what would truly benefit their children." The condescension in her voice was so thick it was almost tangible, and Michael felt his hands clench into fists on the table's surface. Every word she spoke was designed to portray him as a well-meaning but ultimately misguided man whose good intentions couldn't overcome his obvious inadequacies. The narrative was perfect in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Judge Harrison nodded approvingly at Ms. Blackwood's observation, making another note on his legal pad. "Mr. Chen," he said, turning his attention back to Michael with the air of someone preparing to deliver a final judgment, "I'm going to be frank with you. Based on the evidence presented today, I'm inclined to grant the petitioner's request for temporary custody modification pending a full psychological evaluation and home study." The words hit Michael like a thunderbolt, so unexpected and final that for a moment he couldn't process their meaning. Temporary custody modification meant Emma would be taken from him today, right now, and placed in the Worthingtons' care while strangers evaluated his fitness as a parent. The thought of going home to an empty apartment, of not being there when Emma got off the school bus, of explaining to her why she couldn't come home, made his vision blur with unshed tears. "Your Honor," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper, "please, you can't do this. Emma needs stability right now, and taking her away from the only home she's known since her mother died would be traumatic for her. I'm begging you to reconsider." Judge Harrison's expression softened slightly, but his resolve remained firm. "Mr. Chen, I understand this is difficult, but the court must prioritize Emma's long-term welfare over short-term emotional considerations. The Worthingtons are prepared to provide her with immediate enrollment in an excellent school district and access to counseling services to help her adjust to the transition." Michael felt the world tilting around him as he realized that all his careful preparation, all his documentation of Emma's happiness and stability, had been meaningless from the moment he walked into this courtroom. Judge Harrison had seen a janitor in an ill-fitting suit and had made his decision accordingly, dismissing Michael's arguments as the desperate pleas of a man who couldn't see beyond his own limitations. The bailiff had straightened to attention, preparing for what everyone in the room except Michael seemed to understand was the inevitable conclusion of this hearing. Ms. Blackwood was already organizing her papers with the satisfied efficiency of someone whose victory had never been in doubt. The court reporter continued her steady transcription, capturing for posterity the moment when Michael's world came crashing down around him. But as Judge Harrison prepared to deliver his final ruling, as the machinery of the legal system moved toward its predetermined conclusion, none of them could have anticipated what Michael was about to say next. Michael stood frozen at his table, the judge's words echoing in his mind like the tolling of a funeral bell. Temporary custody modification. The phrase seemed to hang in the air, growing heavier with each passing second. Around him, the courtroom had taken on the quality of a nightmare, everything moving in slow motion as the reality of what was about to happen crashed over him in devastating waves. Judge Harrison was reaching for his gavel, the movement deliberate and final. The sound of wood striking wood would seal Emma's fate, would tear her away from the only parent she had left in the world. Michael thought of her face that morning, how she had made him promise to pick her up from school at exactly 3:15 because she had something special to show him. A drawing, she had said, bouncing on her toes with excitement. A surprise that would make him smile. "Your Honor," Michael said, his voice cutting through the courtroom's expectant silence with unexpected strength. The words came from somewhere deep inside him, from a place that had been dormant for so long he had almost forgotten it existed. "Before you make that ruling, I need to address several significant errors in the petitioner's legal arguments." The room went completely still. Judge Harrison's hand paused in midair, the gavel suspended above its wooden block like a sword of Damocles. Ms. Blackwood's confident expression flickered for just a moment, uncertainty creeping into her eyes like shadows at sunset. Even the court reporter's fingers hesitated over her machine, as if sensing that something fundamental had just shifted in the courtroom's dynamics. "Mr. Chen," Judge Harrison said slowly, his voice carrying a warning that suggested Michael was about to overstep boundaries that had already been firmly established, "I believe we've heard sufficient argument from both parties. Unless you have new evidence to present, I'm prepared to make my ruling." But Michael was no longer the overwhelmed janitor who had walked into this courtroom 2 hours ago. Something had awakened in him, something that had been buried under months of grief, exhaustion, and the grinding weight of trying to survive as a single parent. The man who stood before Judge Harrison now carried himself differently, his shoulders straighter, his voice clearer, his presence suddenly commanding attention in a way that made everyone in the room sit up and take notice. "Your Honor," Michael continued, his tone respectful but absolutely unwavering, "with all due respect, the petitioner's case relies heavily on unsupported assumptions about the correlation between socioeconomic status and parental fitness. Their argument fundamentally misapplies the precedent established in Troxel v. Granville, which specifically affirmed that fit parents act in their children's best interests and that courts should not substitute their judgment for that of a parent simply based on economic considerations." The silence that followed was so profound that Michael could hear his own heartbeat. Judge Harrison's expression had changed completely, the casual dismissiveness replaced by sharp attention. Ms. Blackwood had gone pale, her confident demeanor evaporating like morning mist as she realized that the man she had been treating as an insignificant obstacle possessed knowledge that rivaled her own. "Furthermore," Michael said, opening his manila folder with hands that were now completely steady, "the petitioners have failed to meet the burden of proof required under State Statute 1410129, which mandates clear and convincing evidence that a change in custody would serve the child's best interests. Photographs of modest living conditions and speculation about future opportunities do not constitute such evidence, particularly when weighed against the documented emotional stability and academic success Emma has maintained in my care." Judge Harrison set down his gavel completely, leaning forward in his chair with the focused attention of a man who had just realized he was not dealing with who he thought he was dealing with. The transformation in the courtroom's atmosphere was palpable, as if the very air had become charged with electricity. "Mr. Chen," the judge said carefully, his voice carrying none of its earlier condescension, "you seem remarkably well versed in family law precedent. Might I ask about your background in legal matters? Michael felt a bitter smile tug at the corners of his mouth as he thought about all the assumptions that had been made about him, all the dismissive looks and condescending comments that had been delivered by people who saw only the surface of his life. For 18 months, he had allowed himself to become invisible, to fade into the background as he focused entirely on keeping Emma safe and cared for. But Emma's future was on the line now, and invisibility was a luxury he could no longer afford. "Your Honor," Michael said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent years commanding the attention of lecture halls filled with law students, "I hold a Juris Doctor from Harvard Law School, where I graduated magna cum laude. I completed my master's degree in constitutional law at Yale, and I spent 7 years as a tenured professor of constitutional and family law at the State University before Emma was born." The revelation hit the courtroom like a physical force. Ms. Blackwood's mouth fell open in shock, her carefully constructed case suddenly appearing as flimsy as tissue paper. Judge Harrison's eyes widened as he processed the implications of what he had just heard, realizing that he had been condescending to a man whose legal credentials far exceeded his own. "I left academia when Emma was born because I wanted to be present for her childhood," Michael continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "When Sarah was diagnosed with cancer, I took a leave of absence to care for both of them. After she died, I chose to remain in employment that allowed me flexible hours and the ability to be available whenever Emma needed me. I chose love over prestige, Your Honor. I chose being a present father over professional recognition." The court reporter's fingers flew over her machine, struggling to capture not just the words but the electric atmosphere that had transformed the courtroom. The bailiff, who had witnessed countless hearings over the years, found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn into a drama that had suddenly become far more complex than anyone had anticipated. Judge Harrison sat back in his chair, his expression a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and growing respect. The man he had been prepared to dismiss as an inadequate parent had just revealed himself to be someone whose understanding of the law might well surpass his own. The assumptions that had seemed so reasonable just moments before now appeared prejudiced and unfounded. The courtroom remained suspended in stunned silence as the weight of Michael's revelation settled over everyone present like a heavy blanket. Judge Harrison's face had gone through a series of expressions, from shock to embarrassment to something approaching awe. The man who had been so quick to dismiss Michael's arguments based on his appearance now found himself face-to-face with someone whose legal expertise likely exceeded his own. Ms. Blackwood had recovered enough to close her mouth, but her face remained pale as she frantically whispered with her associates. Their carefully orchestrated presentation, built on assumptions about Michael's capabilities and background, had just crumbled like a house of cards in a hurricane. The confident attorney who had been so certain of victory now looked like someone who had just realized she was severely outgunned. "Professor Chen," Judge Harrison said quietly, the title carrying new weight and respect that had been completely absent from his voice just moments before. The transformation in his demeanor was startling, his earlier condescension replaced by the careful deference one legal professional showed another. "I must apologize for my earlier assumptions about your circumstances and capabilities." Michael nodded acknowledgement of the apology, but his expression remained serious and focused. The time for social niceties had passed, replaced by the urgent need to dismantle the case that threatened to tear Emma away from him. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years teaching these very principles to aspiring lawyers, "I'd like to address the fundamental flaws in the petitioner's arguments point by point." He opened his manila folder again, but now the simple document carrier seemed less like evidence of poverty and more like the understated confidence of someone who didn't need expensive props to make his case. The papers inside, which Judge Harrison had earlier dismissed as inadequate, now commanded the room's complete attention. "First," Michael continued, "the petitioners have attempted to establish a correlation between financial resources and parental fitness that has been repeatedly rejected by appellate courts across the country. In Martinez v. State Department of Social Services, the court specifically held that economic disadvantage alone cannot justify removal of a child from a loving, stable home environment." Judge Harrison was taking notes again, but now his pen moved with the careful attention of someone recording important legal precedents rather than the dismissive scribbles of earlier. The bailiff had straightened to attention, and even the court reporter seemed more engaged, as if sensing that she was witnessing something extraordinary. Second, Michael said, his confidence growing as he fell back into the familiar rhythm of legal argument, the petitioners have presented no evidence of actual harm or neglect. Emma's academic performance has remained consistently excellent, her health records show no missed checkups or medical concerns, and her teacher's reports, which I have here, consistently praise her emotional stability and social development. He removed a stack of documents from his folder, each one carefully organized and annotated with the precision of someone who understood exactly how to build a legal case. These weren't the desperate scramblings of an overwhelmed parent, but the methodical preparation of someone who knew the law inside and out. Ms. Blackwood finally found her voice, though it lacked the confident authority she had displayed earlier. "Your Honor," she said, attempting to regain control of the proceedings, regardless of Mr. Chen's background, the fundamental issue remains the same. The Worthingtons can provide Emma with opportunities and advantages that her current situation simply cannot match. Michael turned to face her directly, and for the first time since the hearing began, Ms. Blackwood seemed to shrink slightly under his gaze. "Counselor," he said, his voice carrying the patient tone of a professor addressing a student who had missed a crucial point, "you're arguing that wealth should trump parental rights, which directly contradicts the Supreme Court's holding in Pierce v. Society of Sisters that parents have a fundamental right to direct their children's upbringing." The legal citations flowed from Michael's lips with effortless precision, each one carefully chosen to demolish another pillar of the opposition's case. Years of teaching constitutional law had given him an encyclopedic knowledge of relevant precedents, and now that knowledge was being deployed with surgical precision to protect his daughter. Furthermore, he continued, turning back to Judge Harrison, the petitioner's own evidence undermines their case. The photographs they've presented show a modest but clean and safe living environment. Emma's school records demonstrate consistent academic achievement. There is no evidence of instability beyond the normal adjustments any family might make following the death of a parent. Judge Harrison nodded slowly, his earlier certainty about the case's outcome clearly shaken. "Professor Chen," he said, the formal title now coming naturally to his lips, "you raise compelling legal arguments. But I must ask, why didn't you present these credentials and arguments at the beginning of these proceedings?" Michael's expression softened slightly, revealing a glimpse of the pain and exhaustion that had driven him to accept society's assumptions about his worth for so many months. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "for the past 18 months, I've been focused entirely on being Emma's father. I've been content to be invisible, to work jobs that others might consider beneath someone with my education, because those jobs allowed me to be present for my daughter when she needed me most." He paused, his voice taking on the emotional weight of a man who had sacrificed everything for love. "I've cleaned offices where I once taught seminars to federal judges. I've mopped floors in buildings where I used to deliver lectures on constitutional law. But every night, I came home to Emma, helped her with homework, read her bedtime stories, and tucked her in with the knowledge that she was safe and loved." The courtroom had become completely silent, everyone present drawn into the profound humanity of Michael's words. Here was a man who had chosen love over prestige, presence over professional recognition, and who was now fighting with everything he had to protect that choice. "I never imagined I would need to defend that choice in a courtroom," Michael continued, his voice growing stronger again. "But if fighting for my daughter means revealing who I used to be, then so be it. I am still Emma's father first, and I will use every tool at my disposal to ensure she remains where she belongs." Have you ever had to fight for something precious using skills you'd forgotten you possessed? Michael's story shows us how love can awaken our greatest strengths when we need them most. Judge Harrison set down his pen and looked directly at Michael with newfound respect and understanding. The man who had entered his courtroom as an apparently simple janitor had revealed himself to be someone whose dedication to fatherhood had led him to sacrifice a prestigious career for the sake of being present for his child. The transformation was complete, and everyone in the room understood that this case was far from the simple matter they had initially believed it to be. The atmosphere in the courtroom had fundamentally shifted, like the moment when storm clouds part to reveal clear sky. Judge Harrison sat forward in his chair, his entire demeanor transformed from the dismissive authority figure who had been prepared to separate a father from his daughter into someone who recognized he was in the presence of exceptional legal minds and profound personal sacrifice. Ms. Blackwood attempted to regroup, her expensive suit and polished presentation now seeming almost garish in contrast to Michael's quiet dignity. "Your Honor," she said, her voice lacking its earlier confidence, "while we acknowledge Mr. Chen's impressive credentials, the court must still consider the practical realities of Emma's daily life and future opportunities." Michael turned to face her with the measured calm of someone who had spent years dismantling weak arguments in academic settings. "Counselor," he said, his voice carrying the patient authority of a professor addressing a particularly persistent misconception, "you keep returning to this notion that material advantages should override fundamental parental rights. But let me ask you this, do you have children?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Ms. Blackwood's eyes widened slightly, clearly unprepared for such a direct personal inquiry. "I fail to see how that's relevant to these proceedings," she replied stiffly, but her defensive tone suggested the question had hit its mark. "It's entirely relevant," Michael continued, his voice gaining strength as he moved into territory where his expertise and experience converged, because parenting isn't about providing the most expensive opportunities or the largest bedroom. It's about being present for the moments that matter. It's about understanding that a child's security comes from unconditional love, not from the size of a trust fund. He moved away from his table, his posture straight and confident as he addressed the court with the natural authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention in lecture halls. "Emma has never questioned whether she's loved," he said, his voice carrying across the courtroom with compelling clarity. "She's never wondered if I would be there for her when she needed me. She's never felt abandoned or overlooked because I was too busy pursuing professional achievements to notice her scraped knees or hurt feelings." Judge Harrison found himself nodding involuntarily, drawn into Michael's argument not just by its legal soundness but by its emotional authenticity. The judge's own children were grown now, but he remembered the guilt that had plagued him during their childhood when long hours on the bench had meant missing school plays and soccer games. Here was a man who had made the opposite choice, sacrificing professional recognition for the privilege of being present for his daughter's childhood. "Your Honor," Michael continued, returning to his legal arguments with renewed conviction, "the petitioners have presented no evidence that Emma is suffering any harm in my care. To the contrary, all available evidence suggests she is thriving. Her academic performance places her in the top 10% of her class. Her teacher reports describe her as confident, well-adjusted, and emotionally secure. Her pediatric records show perfect attendance at all wellness visits and vaccinations." He removed another set of documents from his folder, each one meticulously organized and annotated with the precision that had once made him one of the university's most respected professors. "These aren't the characteristics of a neglected child, Your Honor. These are the markers of a child who feels safe and valued in her home environment." Ms. Blackwood's team was engaged in frantic whispered conversations, clearly struggling to adapt their strategy to this unexpected development. Their case had been built on the assumption that they were facing an overwhelmed single parent who could be easily dismissed by the court system. Instead, they found themselves opposing someone whose understanding of family law likely exceeded their own. "Professor Chen," Judge Harrison said, the title now carrying genuine respect rather than grudging acknowledgement, "you've raised compelling arguments about the legal standards that should govern this case. But I must address the elephant in the room. Why did you choose to leave academia? Surely you understand that the court must consider whether your current employment situation provides adequate financial stability for Emma's future needs." Michael's expression grew thoughtful, and for a moment the brilliant legal mind gave way to something more vulnerable and human. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "I made a choice that many people might consider foolish from a financial standpoint. When Sarah was diagnosed with cancer, I took a leave of absence to care for her and Emma. After she died, I found myself as the sole parent of a traumatized 80-year-old who needed me present, not just financially providing." He paused, his hand unconsciously moving to his wedding ring as he gathered his thoughts. "I could have returned to the university," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "I had offers from several prestigious institutions. But Emma needed consistency and stability more than she needed a father with an impressive title. She needed someone who would be there when she woke up from nightmares about losing her mother, someone who could attend every parent-teacher conference and school play, someone whose schedule revolved around her needs rather than department meetings and publication deadlines. The courtroom had grown completely silent, everyone present drawn into the profound humanity of Michael's words. Here was a man who had willingly sacrificed everything that society valued in order to provide his daughter with something more precious, his unwavering presence and attention. "I work evening shifts, Your Honor," Michael said, his voice carrying quiet dignity, "because that allows me to take Emma to school every morning and be home when she returns every afternoon. I work weekends because that provides the additional income we need while still preserving our weekday evenings for homework help and bedtime stories. Every choice I've made has been designed to prioritize Emma's emotional security over my professional advancement." Judge Harrison found himself leaning back in his chair, overwhelmed by the realization of what he had almost done. He had been prepared to remove a child from the care of a father who had restructured his entire life around her needs, based solely on surface appearances and economic considerations. The magnitude of that near mistake settled over him like a heavy weight. Ms. Blackwood made one final attempt to salvage her case. "Your Honor," she said desperately, "regardless of Mr. Chen's sacrifices, the fact remains that the Worthingtons can provide Emma with educational and social opportunities that far exceed what her current situation offers." Michael turned to face her with an expression that was both compassionate and utterly devastating in its intellectual precision. "Counselor," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years studying the very principles at stake, "you're arguing that wealth should trump love, that material advantages should override the fundamental right of a fit parent to raise his child. But let me share something with you that you clearly don't understand about parenting." Michael stepped closer to Ms. Blackwood's table, his movement deliberate and controlled. The transformation from humble janitor to commanding legal presence was now complete, and everyone in the courtroom could feel the shift in power dynamics. His eyes held the quiet intensity of someone who had been pushed beyond his breaking point and was now fighting with everything he possessed. "The most important thing you can give a child," Michael said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom with devastating clarity, "is not a swimming pool or private school tuition or a bedroom suite larger than most people's apartments. The most important thing you can give a child is the unshakable knowledge that they are valued, protected, and loved unconditionally." He turned back to Judge Harrison, his posture straight and his voice growing stronger with each word. "Emma has that knowledge, Your Honor. She wakes up every morning secure in the understanding that her father will be there for her. She goes to sleep every night knowing that someone loves her enough to have sacrificed everything else in order to be present for her childhood." Ms. Blackwood's face had gone pale as she realized that her carefully constructed case was not just falling apart, but being systematically demolished by someone whose understanding of both law and parenting far exceeded her own. "Your Honor," she said desperately, "we're not suggesting that Mr. Chen doesn't love his daughter. We're simply arguing that love alone isn't sufficient when we consider Emma's long-term prospects and opportunities." Michael's expression grew sad as he looked at the attorney with something approaching pity. "Counselor," he said quietly, "you've just revealed something deeply troubling about your understanding of childhood development and family dynamics. Love isn't just one factor among many in a child's well-being. Love is the foundation upon which everything else is built." He moved back to his table and withdrew another document from his manila folder, handling it with the reverence of someone presenting sacred text. "This is a letter Emma wrote to me last month," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Her teacher assigned the class to write about their heroes. Would you like to know what she wrote about me?" Judge Harrison nodded, his expression showing genuine interest rather than the polite attention he might have given to typical custody hearing evidence. The courtroom had become so quiet that the rustle of paper seemed unnaturally loud as Michael unfolded the letter. "She wrote," and I quote, Michael began, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes, "My daddy is my hero because he takes care of me even when he's tired. He works really hard but he always has time to help me with my homework and read me stories. When I had bad dreams after mommy died, he slept on the floor next to my bed until I felt safe again. My daddy makes the best pancakes and he never misses my school plays even though his back hurts from working so much. I love my daddy because he chose me." The last 3 words hung in the air like a benediction. He chose me. In the simple wisdom of a child, Emma had captured the essence of what made Michael's sacrifice so profound. He had chosen her over prestige, over financial security, over professional recognition. He had chosen fatherhood over everything else the world considered valuable. Judge Harrison's eyes had grown bright with unshed tears as he absorbed the full impact of Emma's words. In 23 years on the bench, he had heard countless arguments about custody and parental fitness, but he had rarely encountered anything as powerful as the simple testimony of a child who felt utterly secure in her father's love. Ms. Blackwood made one final, desperate attempt to salvage her case. "Your Honor," she said, her voice lacking any of its former confidence, emotional testimony aside, the court must still consider practical realities. The Worthingtons can provide Emma with educational advantages that will serve her throughout her life. Michael folded Emma's letter carefully, placing it back in his folder with hands that were completely steady. Then he looked up at Ms. Blackwood with an expression that was both gentle and absolutely devastating in its intellectual precision. "Counselor," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years studying exactly these issues, "you keep returning to this assumption that expensive education automatically translates to better outcomes for children. But research consistently shows that parental involvement and emotional security are far stronger predictors of academic and life success than socioeconomic status." He turned back to Judge Harrison, his voice gaining strength as he moved into the familiar territory of academic argument. "The longitudinal studies are clear, Your Honor. Children who feel securely attached to their primary caregivers consistently outperform their peers across multiple measures of well-being, regardless of family income or educational expenditures. The Harvard study of adult development, which has followed subjects for over 80 years, conclusively demonstrates that the quality of relationships in childhood is the strongest predictor of lifelong happiness and success." Judge Harrison was taking notes again, but now his writing had the careful attention of someone recording profound insights rather than routine legal arguments. The bailiff had moved closer, drawn into testimony that transcended typical courtroom proceedings. Even the court reporter seemed more engaged, as if recognizing that she was witnessing something extraordinary. Furthermore, Michael continued, his voice carrying the confidence of someone presenting irrefutable evidence, "Emma's current academic performance already places her in the top percentile of her class. Her teachers consistently report that she demonstrates exceptional emotional maturity, strong social skills, and remarkable resilience in the face of adversity. These are not the characteristics of a deprived child, Your Honor. These are the markers of a child who has been raised with consistent love, attention, and guidance." Ms. Blackwood's team had given up their whispered consultations, recognizing that they were completely outmatched. Their case, which had seemed so strong when built on assumptions about economic advantage, had crumbled in the face of Michael's combination of legal expertise and profound parental wisdom. "Professor Chen," Judge Harrison said, his voice carrying genuine admiration, "you've presented compelling evidence that Emma is thriving in your care. But I must ask, given your obvious qualifications and expertise, have you considered returning to academia? Surely your earning potential would be significantly higher, which would address the financial concerns raised by the petitioners." Michael's expression grew thoughtful as he considered the question that went to the heart of everything he had sacrificed for Emma's sake. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "I could return to the university tomorrow. I have standing offers from several prestigious institutions. But Emma is 8 years old. She will only be 8 once. She will only have this childhood once. I can rebuild my career when she's older and more independent, but I can never reclaim these precious years when she needs me most." The profound simplicity of his answer settled over the courtroom like a revelation, and Judge Harrison found himself nodding slowly as he fully grasped the magnitude of Michael's commitment to fatherhood. Judge Harrison set down his pen and looked directly at Michael with an expression that had transformed completely from the dismissive authority figure who had opened the hearing. The man before him was no longer just another desperate parent pleading for custody, but a fellow legal professional whose sacrifice and dedication had revealed depths of character that commanded profound respect. "Professor Chen," the judge said, his voice carrying genuine admiration, "in 23 years on this bench, I have rarely encountered such a compelling combination of legal expertise and parental devotion. Your arguments have not only addressed the legal standards governing this case, but have fundamentally challenged my own assumptions about what constitutes effective parenting." Ms. Blackwood made one last desperate attempt to salvage her case, rising from her chair with the jerky movements of someone who knew she was drowning but couldn't stop fighting the current. "Your Honor," she said, her voice strained and lacking any of its former authority, "we respectfully submit that regardless of Mr. Chen's credentials or emotional appeals, the fundamental question remains whether Emma's current living situation serves her best interests when compared to what the Worthingtons can provide." Michael turned to face her with an expression of infinite patience, like a professor addressing a student who had persistently missed the central point of an important lesson. "Counselor," he said quietly, "you've spent this entire hearing arguing that wealth equals well-being, that material advantages should override fundamental parental rights. But you've presented no evidence that Emma is actually suffering in my care. No evidence of neglect, abuse, or genuine hardship. Your entire case rests on the assumption that more money automatically means better parenting." He moved closer to her table, his presence now commanding the courtroom with quiet authority. "Let me ask you something," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of genuine curiosity rather than hostility. "When Emma has nightmares about losing her mother, should I hire someone with better credentials to comfort her? When she struggles with a math problem, should I send her to a tutor instead of sitting beside her at our kitchen table? When she wants to share the excitement of a good grade or the disappointment of a playground conflict, should I schedule an appointment rather than being immediately available?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, each one highlighting the fundamental disconnect between the Worthingtons' offer of material advantages and the irreplaceable value of a present, devoted parent. Ms. Blackwood's face had gone ashen as she realized that every argument she had made could be turned against her with devastating effectiveness. Judge Harrison was nodding slowly, his expression showing that he had fully grasped the implications of Michael's questions. The court had been prepared to trade a child's emotional security for financial advantages, to substitute material comfort for the irreplaceable bond between a loving father and his daughter. "Your Honor," Michael said, turning back to address the bench with renewed authority, "the petitioners have asked this court to remove Emma from the only stable home she has known since her mother's death, based solely on their ability to provide more expensive opportunities. But childhood isn't about accumulating advantages or maximizing future earning potential. Childhood is about feeling safe, loved, and valued for who you are rather than what you might become." He moved back to his table and picked up Emma's letter again, holding it with the reverence of someone handling a precious artifact. "This letter represents something that cannot be purchased, Your Honor. It represents the unshakable knowledge that she is loved unconditionally, that someone has chosen her happiness over their own convenience, their presence over their prestige." The courtroom had grown so quiet that the distant sound of traffic seemed unnaturally loud. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a moment when legal precedent and human truth converged to create perfect clarity about what really mattered in a child's life. "Furthermore," Michael continued, his voice gaining strength as he moved toward his conclusion, "the petitioner's own behavior undermines their claims of concern for Emma's well-being. They waited 18 months after Sarah's death to file this petition, 18 months during which Emma has demonstrated consistent academic achievement, emotional stability, and social development in my care. Their timing suggests this action is motivated more by a desire to control than by genuine concern for Emma's welfare." Ms. Blackwood attempted one final objection. "Your Honor, the timing reflects our hope that Mr. Chen would recognize his limitations and make appropriate arrangements for Emma's care voluntarily." Michael's expression grew stern as he responded with the precision of someone delivering a final, devastating argument. "Counselor," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction, "my only limitation is financial, and this court has repeatedly held that economic disadvantage alone cannot justify removing a child from a loving home. Every other measure of parental fitness has been not just adequate but exemplary." Judge Harrison had heard enough. He raised his hand slightly, signaling that the arguments had reached their conclusion. "Both counselors may be seated," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone prepared to render judgment. "The court will take a brief recess to consider the evidence and arguments presented today." But even as he spoke those words, everyone in the courtroom understood that the outcome was no longer in doubt. Michael's transformation from dismissed janitor to respected legal authority had completely reversed the hearing's trajectory. The man who had walked into the courtroom as an apparent underdog had revealed himself to be someone whose understanding of both law and parenting far exceeded that of his opponents. As Judge Harrison prepared to retire to his chambers, he looked once more at Michael with an expression of profound respect. The judge had learned something important about the danger of assumptions, about the folly of judging worth by appearances, about the irreplaceable value of a parent who chooses love over prestige. If this story has touched your heart, think about the parents in your own life who made similar sacrifices. Sometimes the greatest acts of love are the ones that go unnoticed by the world, but mean everything to the children who receive them. The bailiff called for the court to rise as Judge Harrison stood to leave, but the real verdict had already been delivered in the transformation of everyone's understanding about what truly mattered in Emma's life. Michael remained standing at his table, no longer the overwhelmed janitor who had entered the courtroom hours earlier, but a father who had fought for his daughter with every tool at his disposal and emerged victorious through the sheer power of truth and love. The heavy oak door to Judge Harrison's chambers closed with a soft click, leaving the courtroom in suspended animation. Michael remained standing at his table, his hands resting on the manila folder that had contained not just legal documents, but the story of a father's love expressed through sacrifice. The transformation that had occurred in this room over the past 3 hours felt almost surreal, like emerging from a long, dark tunnel into brilliant sunlight. Ms. Blackwood and her team sat in stunned silence, their expensive briefcases and leather portfolios now seeming like elaborate props in a play that had taken an unexpected turn. The attorney's confident demeanor had evaporated completely, replaced by the hollow expression of someone who had not only lost a case, but had been thoroughly outmaneuvered by an opponent she had never seen coming. The court reporter continued her faithful transcription, her fingers moving steadily across the machine as she captured every word of what would undoubtedly become one of the most remarkable custody hearings in the court's history. The bailiff, Officer Rodriguez, approached Michael with a slight smile that suggested he had enjoyed watching the dramatic reversal that had just unfolded. "That was something else, Professor," Rodriguez said quietly, using the title with genuine respect. "In 15 years of working these hearings, I've never seen anything quite like what just happened in here." Michael nodded his thanks, but his mind was already racing ahead to the moment when he would see Emma again. He thought of her face when he picked her up from school, how it would light up with relief when she realized that nothing had changed, that they would go home together to their small apartment where she felt safe and loved. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness, each second stretching into eternity as Michael waited for Judge Harrison to return with his decision. Though the hearing's outcome now seemed certain, Michael understood that nothing was final until the gavel fell and the judge's words became part of the permanent record. Ms. Blackwood finally broke the silence, her voice stripped of its earlier confidence. "Mr. Chen," she said, struggling to maintain professional composure, "I want you to know that our arguments today were not personal. We genuinely believed we were acting in Emma's best interests." Michael turned to face her with an expression that was compassionate rather than triumphant. He had won more than a legal victory today, he had reclaimed his identity as both a devoted father and a respected legal mind. The bitterness and anger that had sustained him through months of struggle had been replaced by something deeper and more lasting, the quiet confidence of someone who knew his worth regardless of what others might think. "I understand, Counselor," Michael replied, his voice carrying none of the hostility that might have been expected after such a contentious hearing. "But I hope you've learned something important today about the danger of making assumptions based on appearances. Emma's well-being was never in question except in the minds of people who confused financial resources with parental fitness." The attorney nodded slowly, her expression showing that she had indeed learned something profound about the nature of family and the irreplaceable value of a parent's love. The case that had seemed so straightforward at its beginning had revealed layers of complexity that challenged everything she thought she knew about what constituted a child's best interests. The chamber door opened again, and Judge Harrison emerged with the measured pace of someone who had reached a momentous decision. His expression was serious but carried an underlying warmth that had been completely absent at the hearing's beginning. The transformation in his demeanor reflected not just a change of opinion about this particular case, but a deeper shift in his understanding of what it meant to judge parental fitness. "All rise," Officer Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying the formal authority of ritual even as his expression suggested he was as eager as everyone else to hear the judge's decision. Judge Harrison settled into his chair and looked directly at Michael with an expression of profound respect. The man who had been prepared to dismiss him as an inadequate parent now saw him clearly for what he truly was, a father whose love for his daughter had led him to sacrifice everything else the world considered valuable. "Be seated," the judge said, his voice carrying new gravity as he prepared to deliver a ruling that would determine Emma's future. "After careful consideration of all evidence and arguments presented today, this court is prepared to render its decision in the matter of Emma Chen." Michael felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he waited for the words that would either keep his family together or tear it apart. Everything he had fought for, every sacrifice he had made, every sleepless night and aching muscle had led to this moment of ultimate judgment. The petitioners have argued that Emma's best interests would be served by a change of custody based primarily on financial considerations and material advantages, Judge Harrison continued, his voice measured and deliberate. However, the evidence presented today has demonstrated conclusively that such arguments fundamentally misunderstand the nature of effective parenting and child welfare. Ms. Blackwood's face had gone pale as she realized the direction of the judge's ruling. Her carefully constructed case, built on assumptions about the supremacy of wealth over love, was about to be rejected not just as legally insufficient but as fundamentally flawed in its understanding of what children actually need. Professor Chen has demonstrated not only exceptional legal knowledge but profound wisdom about the nature of parental responsibility, Judge Harrison said, his voice growing stronger with conviction. His choice to sacrifice professional prestige in order to be present for his daughter's childhood represents exactly the kind of parental devotion that this court should protect and encourage rather than penalize. Michael felt tears building in his eyes as he heard the judge's words, each phrase lifting a weight that had pressed on his shoulders for 18 months. The man who had walked into this courtroom as a dismissed janitor was being recognized not just for his hidden credentials but for his wisdom as a father. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued, Emma's own testimony through her letter provides compelling evidence that she feels secure, loved, and valued in her father's care. The court cannot and will not substitute its judgment for that of a demonstrably fit parent based solely on economic considerations. The judge picked up his gavel, the wooden instrument that had threatened to destroy Michael's family now poised to preserve it. Therefore, he said, his voice ringing with finality, the petition for modification of custody is denied. Emma Chen will remain in the primary custody of her father, Professor Michael Chen, where she clearly belongs. The gavel fell with a sound that echoed through the courtroom like a bell of liberation, officially ending a hearing that had transformed everyone who witnessed it. The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom like a declaration of victory, not just for Michael but for every parent who had ever chosen love over prestige, presence over profit. Michael stood motionless for a moment, letting the judge's words wash over him like a healing balm after months of pain and uncertainty. Emma would come home with him today. Their family would remain intact. The nightmare was finally over. Judge Harrison remained seated, his expression thoughtful as he looked at Michael with newfound respect and something that might have been admiration. Professor Chen, he said, his voice carrying genuine warmth, I owe you an apology. I allowed my assumptions about your circumstances to cloud my judgment about your capabilities as both a legal professional and a parent. Today has been a profound reminder that wisdom and worth cannot be measured by appearance or economic status. Michael nodded graciously, feeling no need for vindication now that Emma's future was secure. Your Honor, he replied quietly, I understand how easy it is to make assumptions based on surface appearances. I've been invisible for so long that I had almost forgotten who I used to be. But when Emma's future was threatened, I remembered that some things are worth fighting for with everything you possess. Ms. Blackwood approached Michael's table with the hesitant steps of someone who had been thoroughly humbled by the day's events. Her expensive suit and polished demeanor now seemed almost embarrassing in contrast to the quiet dignity that Michael had displayed throughout the hearing. "Professor Chen," she said, her voice stripped of its earlier arrogance, "I want to apologize for the assumptions I made about you and your fitness as a parent. Today has taught me something important about the difference between wealth and worth." Michael extended his hand to her with genuine compassion, understanding that she had been operating from her own limited perspective rather than malicious intent. "Everyone learns something new when they're willing to look beyond the surface," he said simply. "Emma has taught me that every day since she was born." The courtroom began to empty as the various players in this drama returned to their normal lives, each carrying with them the memory of a hearing that had challenged their fundamental assumptions about parenting, worth, and justice. Officer Rodriguez approached Michael with a broad smile that transformed his usually professional demeanor. "Professor," he said, shaking Michael's hand warmly, "that was the most incredible thing I've ever witnessed in this courtroom. The way you turned everything around, the way you stood up for your daughter, it was inspiring. I'm going home tonight with a completely different understanding of what it means to be a good father." Michael felt a warmth spread through his chest as he realized that his fight for Emma had touched others in ways he had never anticipated. "Sometimes we have to be willing to reveal our true selves to protect what matters most," he replied, thinking of the months he had spent invisible and overlooked, content to be dismissed as long as Emma was safe and loved. As the courtroom cleared, Michael gathered his simple manila folder and prepared to leave the building that had nearly torn his family apart. But Judge Harrison called his name one final time, his voice carrying a note of professional respect that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. "Professor Chen," the judge said, rising from his bench with the formal dignity of his office, "I hope you'll consider returning to academia when Emma is older. The legal profession needs minds like yours, and students deserve to learn from someone who understands not just the law but the human heart it serves." Michael smiled, thinking of Emma's excitement when he picked her up from school each day, her trust that he would always be there when she needed him. "Thank you, Your Honor," he replied. "Perhaps someday, when Emma no longer needs me to be present for every scraped knee and homework assignment. But for now, I'm exactly where I belong." The afternoon sun streamed through the courthouse windows as Michael walked down the marble steps, each footfall echoing with the freedom of a man whose greatest treasure had been preserved. His phone buzzed with a text message from Emma's school, a simple reminder that pickup was at 3:15, but the words filled him with joy that bordered on euphoria. He would be there, as he always was, as he always would be until she no longer needed him. The city streets seemed different as Michael made his way toward Emma's school, the same buildings and sidewalks transformed by his victory into a landscape of possibility rather than struggle. He thought of the evening ahead, of helping Emma with her homework at their small kitchen table, of reading her a bedtime story and tucking her in with the knowledge that their family was secure. As he approached the school, Michael saw Emma through the classroom window, her face pressed against the glass as she watched for his familiar figure. When she spotted him, her face lit up with the pure joy of a child who had never doubted that her father would be there for her. She waved excitedly, and Michael waved back, his heart full to overflowing with the simple miracle of being exactly where he belonged. The school bell rang, and children poured out of the building like birds released from a cage. Emma ran toward him with the boundless energy of childhood, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders as she navigated through the crowd of parents and students. When she reached him, she threw her arms around his waist with the fierce devotion that had sustained him through every difficult moment of the past 18 months. "Daddy," she said, looking up at him with eyes that sparkled with trust and love, "did you have a good day at work?" Michael knelt down to her level, his hands gentle on her shoulders as he looked into the face that represented everything precious in his world. "Yes, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I had a very good day. And now I'm exactly where I want to be." If this story has moved you, if you've seen the power of love over material wealth, of presence over prestige, let us know where you're listening from and subscribe for more stories that celebrate the human heart. Because sometimes the greatest victories are won not in boardrooms or lecture halls, but in the quiet moments when we choose love over everything else the world considers important. Hand in hand, father and daughter walked home together, their future secure and their bond unbreakable, proof that the most powerful force in any courtroom is the truth of a parent's unconditional love.